So, so I would like to welcome Professor Dale Purves for joining us today in our Bar-Ilan University Vision Science Seminar. Dale Purves is a George B. Geller Professor of Neurobiology in the Duke Institute for Brain Sciences, where he remains research professor with additional appointments in the Department of Psychology and Brain Sciences and the Department of Philosophy at Duke University. Professor Purves earned his BA from Yale, an MD from Harvard, and then additional postdoctoral training at Harvard and University College London. He then joined the faculty at Washington University School of Medicine. He later on became the founding chair of the Department of Neurobiology at Duke Medical Center and was subsequently director of Duke's Center for Cognitive Neuroscience. He also serves as the director of the Neuroscience and Behavioral Disorders program at the Duke NUS Graduate Medical School in Singapore. Dale Purves is best known for his work on neural development and synaptic plasticity. His research during the last 20 years has sought to explain visual perception and auditory perception in the context of music. His work touches upon many aspects related to visual perception, including but not limited to depth, color, form perception, visual illusions, geometry of the real world, all with respect to humans and also machine vision, and also relating to multisensory processing and the interplay between vision and audition. He publishes in top-leading journals as PNAS, Nature Neuroscience, Trends in Neuroscience, Trends in Cognitive Neuroscience, and others. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Medicine, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and is the author and co-author or editor of 18 previous books on neuroscience. I would like to add that in some of these, he is communicating his extensive knowledge to the general public via the scientific open access online encyclopedia of Scholarypedia that is freely available as the chapters on neuroscience and on visual illusions. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome you, Dale, to our seminar. We are delighted to have you today with us to hear about your research.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. So I'm sorry for all the confusion. So
no worries.
Technical issues were all solved long ago, but apparently not. So let me start off by saying that I'm happy to have you ask questions, but because I have kind of a story that unfolds, I just as soon have you save your questions to the end. So let me start the presentation with some simple questions of my own, and if you can advance the slide. Okay, so the basic question that informs what I have to say today is, how does the visual brain work? And the answer is nobody really knows. So despite a century of incredibly detailed work on the visual system, nobody really knows how the thing works. And the next slide shows that the answer to the question why is that nobody can explain what we actually see. So you'd think that the answer to the question of what we see is, well, we see the visual world. And the answer is that we don't really see the visual world. And next slide. Next slide. The problem is that what we see doesn't accord with physical reality. So here's a simple demonstration of that statement that goes back a long time in psychology and visual science. And it's just the simplest demonstration of how we see luminance, the intensity of light. And the intensity of light as we perceive it is called lightness or darkness. And when you look at these two simple patterns, the center square in the dark surround and the light surround are actually coming. Can you see my pointer? No.
No, no.
Oh, okay, well, I'll just have to say it then. So in the little squares below, it shows you that the two central squares in the dark surround and the light surround are coming from an identical luminance. So if you measure it with a photometer, those two little squares are physically exactly the same. But when you see them in a dark surround on the left and a lighter surround on the right, they obviously look different. The one on the left looks lighter and the one on the right looks a little bit darker. And that's such an obvious demonstration of the basic problem that we have to contend with in vision. The question we have to answer is, if what we see doesn't accord with physical reality, why is that? And what does that mean about the way the visual system is working? So you might think, let's look at the next slide. You might think that this is in the picture I just showed you, kind of trivial. The differences we see in lightness and darkness are not very great. But here's another example that shows you that, and this has been known for, again, a century, that the difference in lightness and darkness that we see in response to the same luminance can be very great. So if you show the next slide, if you take out the contextual information there and look at these patches that look white in the one hand and almost black in the other. I want to go back and forth between these two slides a couple of times. So yeah, again, you can see that the areas that look light and the areas that look quite dark are in fact coming from exactly the same physical luminance, just as in the first instance that I showed you. So again, you might say, well, maybe this is just a contextual effect that is got some simple explanation. But if you look at the next slide, then you can see that very subtle effects can cause a difference in the perceived lightness and darkness of the surface that you're looking at. So in the central icon here, the central pair of patches here, the upper one looks dark and the lower one looks substantially lighter. This is called the corn-sweet effect, and it's coming from the very subtle difference of, at the junction of these two surfaces, one of the gradients is going from gray to black, and the other gradient is going from, the lower gradient is going from gray to white. And if you just block out, show the next slide, please. You just block out that central corn-sweet edge, as it's called, you see that instantly the surfaces look the same. So again, let's go back and forth between a couple of times once more. So these are instantaneous changes in what you perceive based on a stimulus that's very hard to explain. Why would this happen? What's going on here? Why is this phenomenology that's, again, been known for a very long time happening? And let's go to the next slide. One of the things that, again, if you ask vision scientists, what's going on here? Well, they would say, I think in general, well, these are just illusions. And the fact is, these are not illusions. Illusions is a word that generally means that there is in the stimulus some exceptional configuration of the pattern that is presented to the visual system that makes things go awry. This is not the case. I mean, I put the exclamation point there for a reason. This is the way we see the world all the time. Anytime you see luminance, these factors are in play. And it's not hard to demonstrate this. And it's wrong-headed to think that these are exceptions to the rule. No, this is the way we're seeing the world in terms of luminance and our perception of lightness and darkness in response to that luminance. That is just the way we are seeing the world. And the next question one might ask is what's the reason for these discrepancies? Why is this happening? Why is this strange disconnect between physical reality and perceptual responses to that physical reality? Why is this going on? And the answer is here that biological sensors simply can't measure the real world. And I think a good way of thinking about this to kind of make clear what I have in mind here is the next slide. Let's think about a driverless car. So on the left in the upper panel is a Tesla. I don't know if any of you have a Tesla. We're all encouraged to buy electric vehicles these days. But anyway, this is one of the better ones. And of course, you know that driverless cars operate successfully because they have devices that measure the physical world around them, digital cameras, radar, laser, physical sensors that tell them all of the information that we simply don't have. We don't have in our visual system, in our visual armamentarium, anything like that. We don't measure the luminance. We don't measure physical reality in terms of geometry, distances, or any other aspect of the real world. We just don't have that instrumentation. And on the right, this is the information that we do get. And the point is that the information that we receive is deeply conflated. It's unable to tell us what the real world is. And the diagram just kind of makes the point that the illumination, the reflectives, and the transmittance that are responsible for all of the retinal stimuli that we have are mixed together in a way that can't be disentangled. So the illumination that falls on the surfaces of objects in the world is partly absorbed and partly reflected from those surfaces. It is passed then through an atmosphere that further changes the amount of light that gets to our eye, and the retinal stimulus is a combination of illumination, reflectance, and transmittance. Again, just in the simplest breakdown of this. And to get back from the retinal stimulus to the physical world is simply impossible. There's no way we can disentangle the conflated information, the retinal stimulus, to get back to the contributions of the illuminant, the surface, the transmittance of the situation in which we find ourselves in. That's just not something that we can do. So if you go on to the next slide, the question that kind of presents itself that we have to answer is, how can we behave successfully in the world if we can't measure it, if we can't do what the driverless car does? How can we behave in a way that succeeds despite the lack of physical information about the parameters of the reality which we happen to be in? And the answer is, frankly, nobody knows. I mean, this is a question, or this is a series of questions that people really haven't thought much about in vision. And one understands that. I mean, vision has, by leaps and bounds, succeeded in an enormous variety of challenges, whether it's the physiology, anatomy, or biochemistry of the visual system. And getting that information over the last 50, 60, 70 years, that's been an enormously successful enterprise. But the problem is that all of that information doesn't really answer the question that I posed here. This is a philosophical question, if you like. No one knows how it is that the world that exists physically and can't be translated into physical measurements by our visual system, nonetheless allows us to behave successfully. So the question is, okay, if it's not working, if vision is not working by making measurements of the physical world, a la driverless car, what is the way in which we might think about how it is working? Obviously, we're solving this puzzle, and we are here to have this conversation. And it's largely dependent on the success of vision over evolutionary time. So we solve the puzzle, but how do we do it? And the next slide sort of introduces the same figure that I showed you before. In thinking about the solution to any problem, you can think of it in two ways. You can think of it in computational terms as an algorithmic solution. You follow a set of rules and you get to an answer by a trajectory that's laid out in logical terms. The other way to solve problems is empirically. That means by trial and error. So you don't depend on logical knowledge about the physiology, anatomy, and biochemistry of the visual system. You ask, could it be working by trial and error, just by over the 3.5 billion years that life has existed on planet Earth? Has the accumulation of information just by trial and error allowed us to behave successfully despite the challenge presented by the lack of measuring instruments in biology that are rampant in physics and signified here by my little analogy with a driverless car. So let's look at this simple pattern and ask, is there a way of explaining why we see the central patches that are, again, exactly the same luminance? Is there a way of understanding why we see the left one as lighter than the right one? The left one being a little bit lighter, the right one being a little bit darker when embedded in a dark surround on the left and a light surround on the right. Is there a way of understanding this empirically? And by that, I mean, just on the basis of accumulated experience with stimuli and how in behaving in response to those stimuli, success is obtained. So let's look at the next slide. Here's how you can address that question and answer it. So on the lower left, the 4 panels are just black and white images of the natural world. And so in this work, I mean, there are thousands of these images that are available on the internet that you can use as a database. And what's done here is to use the pattern, the central patch in the light surround. I'm talking about the graph on the lower right and the 2 patches on the lower right now. So you can ask for an analysis that asks, what is the central luminance in a patch in the natural world, a little template like this that you can apply millions of times to the scenes? What is the luminance when the surround is dark compared to the luminance of the central patch when the surround is light? And the red and the blue line show you the cumulative probabilities of those 2 situations. The red line showing you one of the surrounds, the blue line showing you the other. And it's obvious that the percentile rank of these 2 situations, the dark surround and the light surround, give you a different answer for the luminance that on average, of course, is present in the central patch in these two situations. And the cumulative probability distributions show you that when the surround is relatively dark compared to the center patch, you get a different percentile rank of the statistics in this situation than when the surround is light. And the difference between these two statistically obvious situations is nominally the explanation of this. So let me put that in different terms. When the surround of a central patch, again, remember that these are templates, small templates that you apply millions of times to thousands of natural scenes to get these data, that it's obvious why the two central patches in a dark surround and a light surround should be different. When you apply these, and you can see this in the four patches that are four scenes that are illustrated here. When the surround is dark, on average, you are likely to get a darker luminance, a less intense luminance from the center. When the surround is relatively light, you're likely to get a relatively light patch in the center. Why is that? Just because the world is made up of stuff, whereas you can see from these pictures, if you apply little templates to this millions of times, on average, the surround for a dark patch is going to be relatively dark, and the surround for a light patch is going to be relatively light. Why? Just because stuff in the natural world tends to be surfaces that are made of the same stuff. The flowers, the leaves, the fields, the water, they are all, again, statistically going to give you this result. And these are actual data. I mean, the lines are very smooth here, look like they're just, you know, some phony baloney, but because you can do this so many millions of times, you get very accurate data. So the idea here would be that empirically, it's the case that when the center patch here on the left in the upper panel is in a dark surround, it's on average going to be lighter than when the central patch is in the light surround. And when you translate that into vision, then the result here in the standard lightness effect, this stimulus, is explained by the statistics of what's out there in the world. Now, let's go on to the next slide. So, first of all, why does that help us? So, I mean, I think anybody looking at this or listening to what I'm saying or reading what I've said and work on this would think, well, how does that help you? I mean, why would seeing something that doesn't really correspond to the physical world, why would that be useful? And the answer is, it doesn't make any sense in terms of physics, but it makes perfect sense in terms of succeeding in a world that's basically hidden from us, ergo the title of the talk. So we see these phenomena because it allows us to succeed in a world that we have no way of measuring physically. And that leads to the question, because the demonstration in the little example that I've shown you is very rudimentary. It leads to the question of, well, is this something you can demonstrate in the other qualities of vision that we enjoy? The perceptions of form, perceptions of color, the perceptions of motion. And the answer is yes. And so Sharon mentioned that this, has been work going on for 20 years now. So there are a whole lot of examples that show that this explanation is applicable to the whole range of perceptions that vision allows us to have. And I'm just going to show you one more, because I think it's a simple one, just like the light and dark that I've been talking about. Next slide. So, there are lots of examples in any of these domains of vision that I could trot out, and I'll mention some readings on this at the end. But this example is another compelling case, I think, where what we see in the context of form is also explained statistically by the frequency of occurrence of the retinal images that we've experienced over time, and how we have to use those retinal images to succeed in a world that's basically hidden from us, in terms of, by that I simply mean hidden because we don't have any physical measuring instruments to tell us, like the driverless cars, what the world is really like. So here on the left is a psychophysical demonstration of something that was first measured in the 19th century. And I'm sure you all know this, that when you see a line, its orientation affects its perceived length. So in this left-hand panel, all of these lines are physically identical. But if you measure the response of people to lines in different orientations, as shown here, you get, as indicated in this right-hand graph, that's just a layout of the standard psychophysical testing of this. There's a substantial difference between your perception of a line that's horizontal versus a perception of lines that are vertical. So this is the famous Lincoln hat effect. And vertical lines are seen as being a little bit longer, not so little, 10–15% longer than lines that are horizontal. The interesting thing here, and why this particular demonstration is so impressive to me, and I think to others, is that the vertical line here at 90 degrees is longer than the horizontal line, but the peak of the discrepancy between the length of lines is actually occurring when the line is presented 10 or 15% or 20% off vertical. So here's a real challenge. I mean, how is this McDonald's arches psychophysics, how can you possibly explain that in terms of the frequency of occurrence of line lengths in the real world? How can you show that, just like the perception of luminance, the perception of form, again here just in the sense of, or just in the context of lines of different orientations, how can you show what is happening here, and that makes sense in terms of the frequency of occurrence of stimuli that we visual animals have always seen? And so this is not about human beings, this is about any visual animal. So next slide shows the way of getting at this. So in the case of the luminance that we talked about, pretty straightforward. You just measure with photometer the luminances in patterns that are occurring from real world scenes, as I showed. Here you need something a little bit more complicated. You're asking, what's the frequency of occurrence of line lengths as a function of their orientation, again, in the real world? So here you need to use a laser scanner that will record in the physical world the lengths of lines in terms of their frequency of occurrence presented to us as human beings with all our special, our height and so on. So next slide shows that you can do this again. You take natural scenes, you apply millions of times lines in different orientations and different lengths to get the frequency of occurrence of stimuli of straight lines in different orientations that we see and our species has seen forever. So again, when you do this in many, many natural scenes, again, collecting millions of observations, you get a frequency of occurrence of lines of different lengths and different orientations as they are occurring in the real world. So here, again, this is a little bit complicated, but let me see if I can make it simple. The white lines here are lines where in the physical world, the laser scanner showed that there was actually a straight line of points that were contiguous of that length. So the white ones are where the answer was, yes, there is a straight line there in response to the test of that line length in that orientation. The red lines are where the answer was negative. So here you can see that, no, there's no contiguous straight line there. Here again, the red ones are instances where there's no straight line at that length and that orientation. So again, by doing this innumerable times, you get a database of the frequency of occurrence of the presentation on our retinas of lines of different lengths in different orientations. And the next slide shows you that, again, here's the psychophysics that we saw. The McDonald's arches are the challenge for the explanation. Why would you have these McDonald arches and vertical lines a little bit less pronounced in their perceptual lengths? And here is the data from, again, many millions of trials like the ones I showed you. And you see that the frequency of occurrence of lines presented to us matches quite well with the McDonald's arches that the psychophysics shows. The reason for that are complicated. I'm not going to, I mean, they're not, they just take a long time to explain. They're not complicated in principle. Why there are more lines at 15 or 20 degrees off vertical than at vertical is straightforward, but I'm going to skip that explanation, but you can certainly read about it if you want. The point is that the psychophysics is well matched by the frequency of occurrence of, in this case, form measured by the contingency of lines of different lengths in different orientations. So again, there are many more examples that make the same point, but this simply shows that in another domain, form, as opposed to the domain of lightness and darkness, again, shows that this is a plausible explanation of why it is that we see the world the way we do. So the next slide, if I can have that. Why does this, this comes back to some simple questions. Why does this strategy work? And it works because it's tracking not physical reality, it's just tracking behavioral success. So in evolution, or in personal time for that matter, behavioral success comes from responding to the frequency of occurrence of stimuli rather than the impossibility of trying to understand the underlying physical reality, which we have no means in biology of accessing. So behavioral success takes the place of the driverless car making measurements, and I think it's a strong argument that what we see is the result of getting around the absence of making physical measurements, the absence of devices that can make physical measurements, by using the frequency of occurrence of stimuli over, again, millions of years, millions of instances in our individual lives where we see these things, that if you do this in terms of behavioral success rather than the impossibility, well, that's kind of contradictory, but it's impossible to do it in terms of measurements of the real world, simply because we don't have that apparatus. So the next slide. Asks a somewhat different question. Why is this strategy required? Why is it that we can't do it in some other way? And what I've been telling you so far is that we can't do it in the first instance because we don't have the physical measuring equipment to generate information about the physics that the driverless car gets by virtue of its machinery. But there's another way of looking at this, and this is the complexity of the solutions or of the problems that have to be solved in life, in the biology of living animals that need to succeed in a complex world. So this is looking at it from a somewhat different point of view. And the issue here is when an algorithmic solution to a problem becomes impossible and an empirical solution becomes really mandatory. And I use as an example here, so this is, again, understand, shifting gears a little bit from just the biology and the apparatus that we don't have to the more philosophical question of, in any circumstance, when is an algorithmic solution to a problem not really a plausible option, and when is it necessary to use an empirical strategy to solve the problems that we are presented with? And the example here you'll recognize as the game of Go. And I show this because in the last 10, 15 years, I think enormous progress has been made in understanding these issues by Google DeepMind and the group led by David Silver and Dennis Hasidus and their collaborators, in how you can succeed playing games where the number of possible solutions is extraordinarily large. So again, playing a game like Go, the possible sequence of moves that is involved in playing out all the possible games that the board and the stones present is overwhelmingly large. It's on the order of 10 to the 340th, and that compares to 10 to the 80th, which is the estimated number of atoms in the universe. So extraordinarily large search spaces, extraordinarily large possibilities in a game like Go is presumably dwarfed by the possibilities in the game of life. I don't mean the literal game of life, because there is such a thing, but the game of life in the sense of the way we have to get along in the world. Again, the solution, the search space, is so large that any plausible attempt to solve the problem by an algorithmic approach is just out of the question. And I think the Google DeepMind have realized this and have made fascinating progress in how you win at games that have impossibly large search spaces. And next slide, the answer of course, is familiar to all of us in artificial intelligence, whether it's in the context of game playing or any other challenge to a computational approach to problems that are beyond the pale in terms of an algorithmic solution. So if you take a game like tic-tac-toe, the search space that all the possible games of tic-tac-toe that could be played out is tractable by an algorithmic solution. But even checkers and certainly chess, chess is 1/10 to the 140th in terms of the all the possible ways that a chess game can play out. Those search spaces are just beyond the pale with respect to an algorithmic solution. So if you ask, what's the mechanism by which these statistical percepts in response to the stimuli and the frequency of occurrence of stimuli that I've been talking about, how does that work? Well, the answer is this is a good picture of what the brain is. Of course, this is a simple neural network, or a relatively simple neural network, but you multiply the complexity of that neural network by a billion or so, and you have a rough analogy with what the human brain is. A huge network that can encode all of the kinds of possibilities empirically that I've been talking about. So again, I toss that in because one doesn't want to just leave it with the phenomenology of what we see, but at least point in the generally right direction for the mechanism that could achieve this. And of course, it's neural networks that are, whether it's in the game of Go or many other applications, basically doing similar kinds of things, solving problems empirically because the search spaces are beyond the pale when it comes to solving them algorithmically by logic, by a set of rules. So next slide. So here are really the key points of what I've been telling you. First one is that vision can't measure the physical world, and the goal of visual systems is to circumvent this obstacle, as I've been talking about. Sensory systems generate percepts on the basis of behavioral success, not physical reality. And what we see is the empirical rank of stimulus patterns, whether it's lightness, brightness, in the example that I talked about, or line length in the other example that I gave you. And the bottom line here is that I think this way of looking at things suggests that vision and the rest of the brain, of course, vision is the part of the brain that's probably best understood today. So you could take vision as standing for the brain function generally in any sensory modality, how sensory modalities, how sensory input is translated into behavioral output, that vision and the rest of the brain may really be a whole lot simpler than one's imagined. In principle, it's not saying that it's easy to imagine how in detail this works, but in principle, this may be the empirical solution to the problems that I've presented you with. Suggests that the visual brain and the rest of it may be a whole lot simpler than we have imagined over the recent decades. So I said next slide, last slide. So there's a lot of any of you who are interested in this. These are a bunch of books that deal with the problems that I've been talking about. They all have lists of the papers, again, dating back to the 19th century, of the relevant studies that I've mentioned here. So these are all available on my website or Amazon. And I, of course, invite you to look into that. So as I said, I'd be happy to take questions and fire away.
Dale, thank you very much. It was a really great talk. I want to invite everybody to unmute yourselves, and let's give Dale a very big thank you. And also Yafa, a minor thank you for assisting in the technical, overcoming the technical
Yes.
details. And
Yes, indeed.
thank you very much. Very interesting. And I'm opening the stage for questions. And okay, I'll go first because I don't see if so I'm not sure about this. Okay, so I have a question. If you think that many of these issues arise because our visual world is three-dimensional, and do you think that if we would be living in a two-dimensional world, many of these aspects would not occur? I mean, maybe my question isn't so clear, but I'm thinking that a lot of the three-dimensionality in three-dimensional information may be contributing to many of these well, first of all, many of the ambiguities, but I'm thinking if it has to do also with contributing a lot to the illusions.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the three-dimensionality of the world is another domain of visual perception, distance and depth, and stereoscopy. So just as we've talked about luminance, the physical parameter translated into the perception of lightness and darkness, form as the physical parameter translated into the perception of line lengths and other geometrical aspects of what we see. Three-dimensionality is another domain translated into stereopsis and distance perception, again, based on the frequency of occurrence of the stimuli that we have entertained. So there is an explanation of stereopsis in these books and papers that is similar to the explanation that I've given you for lightness and darkness and form, and you can read about that. But the answer is the same. The frequency of occurrence of images is the best way to explain the phenomenology of stereopsis and distance perception. But again, that's another story. So we talked about the story of luminance, the story of form in these simple examples. There's another story in luminance. There's, of course, a story in color. There's a story in motion. Each of the perceptual domains of vision has its own set of data and its own explanations of why there's a discrepancy between physical measurements and what we see.
Okay, if there's no additional question, I'm going to keep on going. Yeah, Ellie has a question. Okay, so I'll save mine for afterwards. For after. Ellie, do you want to have?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm wondering, the presentation assumes that we need to know the luminance, but the fact that we are doing many experiments on luminance and we're interested in it doesn't mean that for functionality we actually need the luminance. In fact, I try hard to find examples of that, and there are, but very few. In general, we're not interested in the luminance, but rather in some other characteristics of things in the world, such as whether there is an obstacle there, there is a danger there, or there's a food there, or things of that nature.
The basic fact is that we don't have in our visual systems a way of measuring the luminance. We are not, the retinas are not, that we
Right.
have not photometers. So we have to get at the response that we need to execute in response to any pattern of luminance, again, by the frequency of occurrence of those patterns in terms of behavioral success, not in terms of luminance per se.
Yeah,
which-
but the behavioral success is not measured by getting the correct luminance. It's
No,
not,
of course not. It's behavioral success is living to reproduce and
right,
behave another day.
right. So maybe luminance has very little purpose and therefore we didn't develop to have a luminance
I
measure.
think that's one way of putting it. Certainly, we didn't develop a way like the driverless car of measuring luminance per se. We get around the hidden luminance that we can't access by behavioral success of the patterns of lightness and darkness that are presented to our retinas. That was the point of the first demonstration that I showed you.
If nobody is continuing, there's just a follow-up. Why is the driverless car needs luminance? It really doesn't care whether it runs into a white-skinned person or a dark-skinned person and a dark color car or a lighter.
I don't think that's right. So you remember one of the famous cases
Yes.
of fatality in the Tesla, the evolution of Tesla as a driverless car is where the car mistakes a white truck for a different set of physical possibilities. So no, the luminance is used by the digital camera, of course, in the driverless car in ways that we don't have, but that are useful for the driverless car.
Okay. I'm not sure how is the digital camera different than the retina in transmitting luminance information.
Because the luminance, the candelas per meter squared,
Yes, yeah.
is a direct measurement that the digital camera can make, that we make with our iPhones all the time, that we don't have that possibility. Our retinas are not photometers.
Well, but they do photometric transmission, and they then do some processing to expand the dynamic range or other things that are limited. But in principle, they convert photons, number of photons, to firing rates.
I think if you think about that in terms of what I've said, you see that that just can't work. I mean, of course.
Of course it doesn't work, yes, but it doesn't work even for the camera in a way, or even if the camera gives a better response, it's still not being used as the luminance, but rather.
Well, I don't know enough about driverless car technology to answer the question of how the digital information is about luminance is used directly.
Yeah, they're in fact, it's not enough. They use the other sensors. Some of those sensors
Yes, of
are
course. Radar, laser. They use many of the sensors. They have all kinds
so
of.
they don't really.
They don't depend on
the luminance. They use they use the whole integration. Which,
yes, of course, of course.
Which the visual system uses the stereo, that cue, the monocular cues, etc. in a similar way.
Well, I don't think it is a similar way.
In the black box similar way, in the sense that image come in response out, not necessarily with the same algorithm.
So what's in the black box is for a driverless car, physical measuring equipment. What's in the black box in the biological visual system is not that, but it is a way of accumulating frequency of occurrence of images to generate behavior that is successful in the sense of allowing us to survive and reproduce.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that, but I think it doesn't go to luminance, because the luminance is indeed not that important.
Dale, are you also okay with continuing to take more questions, or?
Sure.
So I wanted to ask, I mean, this is, maybe hard to answer question, but what do you think all these aspects are? How do they relate to the perception versus action related pathways in the visual system? So we think that some of our vision is dedicated to understanding form, and some is dedicated to understanding the space around us and to prepare us for action. And do you think all these, let's say, non-optimal deciphering of visual information, do you think it has to do with a combination of these two channels, or do you think they're more related to dorsal or to the ventral pathway related processing?
Well, I'm going to say something that seems quite radical, but I don't think that kind of information is particularly relevant. So I'm thinking of the famous Fellman and Van Essen connectivity of
Hierarchy.
the visual system in macaques. So, that picture that we've all seen 1,000 times suggests that the connectivity of the system is going to tell us about how it works. But I would have pretty much the opposite view, that the connectivity of the system is not irrelevant, but the reality is that as the higher you go in the visual hierarchy from V1 to the higher reaches of exostriate visual cortex and beyond, you get something that is got very little to do with that initial connectivity. Everything is mixed together in a way that defies the idea that, oh, well, if we understood the connectivity of the visual system, if we understood the connectomics of the visual system, we would understand how the visual system works. I think the reality is just the opposite, that information is misleading in the sense that it makes it seem like the connectivity is going to be important, when what really happens is that the information in vision and other sensory modalities like vision mixed with audition gets more and more removed from the primary characteristics of stimuli, and suggests, again, in connection with what I tried to say in the visual network picture, that's what's happening. I mean, it's just in my view, a neural network that is ultimately based on success and not on a breakdown of the visual characteristics that are suggested by the Fellman and Van Essen picture.
Interesting. I'll follow up with you on that in email, because it's very relevant to thoughts that I have.
Yeah, good.
Okay, so it was a real pleasure having you today with us, and thank you so much for joining and sharing your overview of the physics versus the behavior. Really interesting, and thank you everybody for joining. And I'm really sorry about the technical aspects that we had, and thank you, Yafa, for assisting. So we'll be here, I think we'll be here next week with Batsheva Batshi Haddad from Haifa University, and I will send details about the talk during the following week.
Okay, thanks a lot, Sharon.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure having you. Really interesting. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.